Hi, I'm Marty Cohn, and this is BCTV's Meet the Candidates 2020, sponsored in part by Brattleboro Savings and Loan. This series affords you an opportunity to hear from folks running for elected office. Today, our guest is Richard Morton, a Republican candidate for Vermont House of Representatives, Windham 2-1 District. Welcome, Mr. Morton.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
All righty. So let's get right to the questions. Top one. Why are you seeking this office?
Well, one of the main reasons I would have to identify is that we need balance in Montpelier. I was trying to think of a good illustration to maybe explain why that is important. And so for anyone who comes from Hogback Mountain coming down Route 9, let's say you're in a truck. You've got a lot of curves and you're going to have to be tapping the brakes just to make sure you don't swing off the road and go into the Whetstone Creek, the stream. What I think we've got now is a runaway, not a runaway truck, but a runaway legislature. And the problem is that we've got a veto-proof majority by the Democrats and their allies in this Vermont legislature, so they can basically let that truck roll down the mountain and not worry about the curves, or at least not think about it. What I want to offer the voters is just another thought. Maybe we want to tap the brake a little bit. Maybe you want to slow it down so you're going to hit that corner and make the turn. Still going to go down the road, you make it successfully. So in politics, how do you do that? I believe the best way to do that is to have contrasting viewpoints, and therefore you need another person to represent those viewpoints. That would be me. Right now we've got a completely blue Windham County, and there's no, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but let me just say that there's a tendency to run with the herd. And if you're not being held accountable, then I think there's a tendency to just let the leadership determine the course of action, and you show up and vote according to the instructions or according to the expectation. And I think it's a good idea for the voters of Windham County, the voters in Brattleboro, to think in terms of, we do need a little tap on the brake every now and then. That would be me. That would be somebody like me, to say, hey, wait a second, what are we trying to accomplish here? Is there a better way of doing this? Is the process we're undergoing, does that really take into account the values we have as Vermonters? So that's kind of by illustration of a runaway truck or a runaway legislature I'd like to run. Now, what I'm appealing to here actually is Democrats, progressives, independents, and Republicans. You may be a Democrat, you may be happy the way things are set up as far as the political landscape goes, but what's to restrain the worst excesses of your party? What's to slow them down? And I'm appealing to Democrats and progressives and others, think about that. Maybe I could be a reasonable way of just calling people's attention to the issues we're facing and maybe think twice about some of the directions we're going. I'll leave it at that.
All right. Well, you might have answered this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What sets you apart from the other candidates running for state representative?
Well, different party, different philosophical point of view. And I think probably it's the basic philosophy. You want to look at the party platforms for people who have a tendency to get into the weeds. I'd encourage people to do that. Vermont GOP, that would be a place to go to get the party platform. And that would show you the priorities and the way of achieving those priorities for the Republican Party. And that's going to be one thing that sets me apart. And the fact that I'm not holden to the Speaker of the House in the same way. I have to follow the rules. I have to be respectful. I have to be doing my homework, but it's not going to be exactly the same way.
All right. So if you were elected, talking about priorities, what would be your top two priorities?
Okay. They both have to do with legislation because it's a legislature. And so I want to give a little background, if I could, about why I'm coming up with this particular approach. I call it a 12-step program. I call it that. I don't know if I'm actually going to have 12 steps or not, but this is the idea. We have a legislature which meets from January, February to May, June. And they meet several days a week, four days a week, I believe it is. And they spend their time considering legislation, passing the budget. They're there for that time until they're dismissed, until they finish the agenda. What is going to happen when you have a bunch of people in Montpelier, they're legislators, what they're going to do is legislate. They're going to find something, and if they find they have a little extra time, if they find they have a little, in their little coffee clutches or whatever else they're doing, what about this? What about that? Hey, we could write a rule. We could write a law. And so there's a tendency for legislators to just keep legislating, whether we need it or not. Now, everybody thinks their legislation is the best thing that ever came along. And I'm sure that's probably the case. But what I'd like to see, and this is really my answer to your question, is a more thoughtful process for initiating legislation. I'd like to see, and make this a rule for everyone. What I'd like to propose, whether we call it a 12-step program, a 10-step program, what are you trying to accomplish? Tell us. What are the obstacles? What describe that need? What are the obstacles for meeting that need? What have other states with similar situations tried to do? How far along are they in that process? What steps have they taken? Have they learned anything in the process of solving the problem? In the process of learning those things, have they changed what they set out to do? Maybe we can learn from other people's mistakes. Okay, so that's just a thoughtful beginning process. Now, also, one of the principles that I tend to follow is the least possible government is better than the most possible government. In other words, okay, if we have a job to do, let's do the job, let's get it done, but let's get it done the simplest way, the quickest way, but also the least burdensome way. And let's look at the alternatives. Let's examine those. And I'd like the person who proposes legislation to really take some time and thought into what exists now, and how we can best resolve that particular problem. And that's another part of this, the steps that I'm proposing. I don't really have them written out in a particular order, but what do we have on the books now? What do our laws currently say? Is there anything there we can tweak rather than write a whole new law? I just want a very thoughtful, deliberate, organized process that puts a little burden on the legislators to justify what they're proposing. Now, when a person proposes legislation, it goes before a group of professionals who craft it into legalese. I have no problem with that. That's their job. They do it for both the Democrats and Republicans. They make it so it'll work and fit into the code if it passes. So their job is to make it look good and make it fit. That doesn't mean it's suitable. That doesn't mean it's a good idea. And so that's the kind of thing I want to take. What have we got now? How can we manage that process? Who do we need to talk to? Who are the stakeholders? And take a look at that broad view before you even get into the text of the law. And I think if legislators came to the table with all of those things pretty much worked out, or at least mostly worked out, that would do a couple of things. It would give us more thoughtful legislation, more practical legislation, probably simpler legislation, And it might slow down the volume of legislation. If you think of painting a house, how many coats of paint do you want on your house? You can just put another coat of paint on. So every legislature comes along and they write a whole bunch of new laws. It's another coat of paint on the legislative code. Next year, another coat of paint. Next year, another coat of paint. Next year, another coat of paint. I want to slow that down. I want to make a more orderly process with a more elegant result. I'd like Vermont to have a really elegant legal code. So that means we're going to have to do some sanding, some scraping, some changing around, filling in the gaps, and then in a very positive way, we can put together something that's going to be lasting and look good. Not just look good, but be good. So that's one of the two. The second area really stems a little bit from this first one, and I'm concerned specifically about the governor's statement of emergency declaration process. I would love to see a little more thought and refinement go into that whole process, because right now I think when people think of state of emergency, we think of ice storms and snowstorms and Irene that came through here a number of years ago and did a lot of damage and had roads to, and so we think in terms of weeks, days and weeks, and maybe a couple of months, and then you can fill in the gaps with a few long-term solutions for infrastructure. That's what I think of when I think of state of emergency. But what we've got now is a whole new beast. And this is going on month by month by month by month, and it's extended at the governor's discretion. I'd like to see a little more legislative input and review, and I'd like to see a little more accountability on the part of the chief executive of whatever party, doesn't matter, so that they have to do a little more justification than a series of whereases, whereases, and whereases. They have to give a report to the legislature, because the legislature are the representatives of the citizens, and he needs to, or she needs to justify what, because the state of emergency, the declaration of emergency, is taking a great deal of authority and responsibility into the executive branch. I think that and there may need to be a sunset clause, maybe a sunset clause on most legislation if we're doing a trial basis. But here in this case, there needs to be I think a sunset clause that this declaration is over unless you meet the following conditions, X, Y, Z. Now, I don't have them precisely worked out now, but I'd like to look at the statute which gives the authority to declare an emergency and just say, now that we've gone through this COVID, how can we improve this so that everybody's protected and we have feedback? So those are two areas that I would identify as being perhaps a good legislative focus.
All right, thank you. So I'd like to get into a couple of issues. If you're elected, what would you do to ensure that more Vermont families with young children can find and afford childcare?
This probably is not a politically good response to give, but I probably would not be in favor of the government stepping in. Let's look for the simplest solution, the least burdensome solution. And by burdensome, I mean, partly it's tax code, what's going to result in taxes. So I would offer a word of caution to any legislator wanting to add new layer of paint to our legislative code and our tax code. We have underfunded mandates. We have a budget deficit and a shortfall. Before we can add really anything new, in one sense, you got to take care of what you've already got. We've got workers who work for the state who've been promised a retirement package. Are we going to be able to afford that? If we cannot afford it, and right now we have the shortfall, so we're going to fall millions of dollars short, maybe substantial millions of dollars short. Before we think about adding this, that, or the other bauble or another coat of paint on the tax code. Let's take a look at what we've already committed ourselves to and make sure we're doing that right. So to answer your question, I'd say maybe we'll take a step back and say, okay, let's look at that, but let's take care of these other matters first.
Okay. Well, now I'm going to ask you about the other end of the age spectrum.
The
Recent
elderly.
reports recent reports indicate that seniors in Vermont face one of the highest rates of financial insecurity in the nation. How do you think we can make life for seniors more affordable?
Well, in light of my answer to the first question, I'm going to have a pretty similar response to this one. We're not just simply saying you're completely on your own. People have a whole lifetime in which they can plan for things, and if they wind up here and they're in trouble, we do want to help them. But there is a whole host of community organizations which are set up right now, Senior Solutions and United Way and many others, which are designed especially for the elderly. In fact, I think the elderly have quite a number of resources available to them right now in each local community. So it may be true that there's challenges for the elderly in those declining years, as we might call them. But rather than step in with another government program, another coat of paint, let's take a look at how the best way of solving this is with least burdensome, and again, make sure that we've taken care of our basic responsibilities to prior commitments. We've promised these things. Let's make sure we can fulfill those promises to the people we promised them instead of going off into another direction and adding additional expense.
Okay. Well, so now I'd just like to get what's your vision for Vermont in a post-COVID world? Let's be optimistic. And what's your vision for Vermont? How do you see Vermont in a post-COVID world?
Vermont's a great place. I think it's already a great place. I think has been a good place. We've got issues. Every place has issues. We all have issues. I'd like the government, which is what the legislature is a significant part of, is to function seamlessly and quietly in the background, the least obtrusive, least intrusive manner possible, so that people can come into the state and hardly know that we even got a government, but we do, and it's working, and it's functioning, and it's smooth, and and the people are getting along with one another in Montpelier, and we're getting things done. We're taking care of our bills and our obligations, and we are taking care of one another the best we can. And the government has a role to play, no question about it. We have significant influence in various areas, but I think at the same time, my vision is to have the state humming so smoothly and well and functioning with communities, people looking after one another, that the government is just sort of like a little quiet infrastructure behind the scenes, so to speak, and not mandating brand new massive changes. I would venture to say that the Global Warming Solutions Act is one of those things that is not well thought out. And it's overkill. It's delegating responsibilities that probably are not constitutionally valid from the executive and the legislative to an unelected committee or a series of committees. And I think that was ill-advised. And that's an example of the runaway truck going down Route 9 here in Windham County. And they didn't tap the brakes when they were on that corner. And now we're in danger of slipping off the road into the ditch because we've gone this way. That doesn't mean global warming is a bad thing to deal with. It just means that this was a bad way to handle it. And in a post-COVID world, I think we'd handle this kind of legislation differently and not so heavy-handed, overriding a veto of the governor.
Okay, well, my last question for today is, what do you want voters to know about you?
Um, I think if they hear my views and they have some sense that this guy is at least thoughtful, um, this guy is at least paying attention, and this guy is a lover of Vermont and wants to help, that would be the biggest thing. About my personal background, I suppose you could go through the whole resume thing, and I don't want to really do that. Um, not in any depth anyway. My background was um, compliance and security officer for the Brattleboro Savings and Loan. Happens to be a sponsor of um, this spot. I noticed at the beginning. I didn't know that at first. And they're a community citizen, and they sort of instilled that in all their employees. I brought that to the table anyway, but I picked it up there as well. And I think now's the time to sort of exemplify that if I possibly can. So I'll leave it at that. I am a Christian. I'm a chaplain. I work at Vernon Evan Homes on a part-time basis down there to help the elderly there. And so I guess those are some metrics in my resume that might be helpful for some people.
Okay, well, Richard Morton, a Republican candidate for Vermont House of Representatives, Wyndham 2-1 District. Thanks for being on the show.
You're welcome. Glad to be with you.
Okay, well, you can contact him at morton4vtrep@comcast.net. That's Morton, the number 4, VT, rep, R-E-P, @comcast.net. The general election is Tuesday, November 3rd. Remember, you could vote early in person, you could vote absentee by mail, or vote absentee hand-delivered on Election Day. Whichever way works for you, please vote. Thanks for watching Meet the Candidates 2020, sponsored in part by Brattleboro Savings and Loan. I'm Marty Cohn. Stay healthy.